എല്ലാത്തിലേക്കും എല്ലാവരും പങ്കെടുക്കുക. അതോടൊപ്പം ദിയാമാടത്തെ ഞാൻ പ്രത്യേകമായി നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തുന്നു. മകനെ ഞാനിവിടെ ജയന്തിനെ ഞാൻ ഓർമ്മിക്കുന്നു. ആളത്തേക്കില്ലെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നുണ്ട്, അദ്ദേഹം സ്ഥലത്തില്ല. എന്തായാലും എല്ലാവർക്കും ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടി നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തിക്കൊണ്ട് എൻ്റെ വാക്കുകൾ ഉപസംഹരിക്കുന്നു. നമസ്കാരം.
നന്ദി സർ. ഉദ്ഘാടന സമ്മേളനം ഇവിടെ അവസാനിക്കുന്നു. തുടർന്ന് മുഖ്യ പ്രഭാഷണത്തിലേക്ക് കടക്കുകയാണ്. ഡോക്ടർ ചിത്ര പണിക്കരാണ് മുഖ്യ പ്രഭാഷക. ഓൺലൈനാണ് പ്രഭാഷണം. മാഡത്തെ ഇൻട്രൊഡ്യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്നതിനായി ഡോക്ടർ സജി മാത്യുവിനെ ക്ഷണിക്കുന്നു.
Good morning. We are entering into the proper academic session now. I request all of you to be seated. And we have the keynote address right now by Dr. Chithra Panikar. And Professor Chithra Panikar teaches at the Department of English, Bangalore University. After her PhD work on James Joyce and Marshall Proust from the Institute of English, Kerala University, she worked as resident scholar in the James Joyce Foundation, Zurich, Switzerland for a year. On her return to India, she worked as lecturer in the Center for Comparative Literature, Hyderabad Central University for 8 years, and as reader in the Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies in the same university for 6 years. Her areas of interest span literary and cultural theory, translation studies, and Indian literatures, Joyce studies being her specialization. She has translated and published 8 chapters of Joyce's Ulysses into Malayalam and continues to translate literary and critical texts from Malayalam into English and vice versa while theorizing those practices. She has been on a fellowship of the Department of Culture, Government of India for 2 years and has been an associate fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. For the last few years, as part of a research program sponsored by the UGC, she has been consistently working on questions of identity and has published articles that offer an interdisciplinary perspective on literary texts. Apart from her ongoing interest in curricular revisions and syllabus designing, she has been socially active on issues of gender and caste. Her topic for today's lecture is Impossible Yet Inevitable, the Interpretive Act of Translation.
Good morning to everyone. Actually, lots of friends in the School of Letters. Mine was only a presentation first. Later, by some strange quirk of fate, it transformed into a keynote address. I have known Krishnan, who is retiring from service shortly, for a long time. We were co-participants in a refresher course in Jadavpur University almost a quarter of a century ago and have remained in touch off and on these many years. I respect Krishnan as an individual and as a teacher, and it feels nice to be associated with a program that pays tribute to his years of fruitful work in the School of Letters. I am honored to give this lecture, and I thank Dr. Saji Matthew, who is responsible for getting me to do this. Let me also wish my friend Krishnan a beautiful, satisfying life post-superannuation. Now I'll move on to the formal lecture. My lecture today is titled Impossible Yet Inevitable, the Interpretive Act of Translation. A few days ago, I did a lecture on rethinking the human in the context of COVID-19. I now realize that many of the writers and philosophers whose texts I quoted from then are texts that were originally written in German, French, Portuguese, or Spanish. As students, teachers, scholars, we assume that these texts have all reached us without any mediation, in some unmediated form, and that we are actually on clear, safe grounds when we quote from theoretical texts that are written in other languages. In other words, we are sometimes apologetic about not having enough access to the source text when we discuss literary texts. But when it comes to philosophical texts or social science texts, we take it for granted that the idea or the content can be transferred to another language without raising the question of translation. This may actually not be very wise because there are theoretical texts that are highly lyrical and poetic. For example, Nietzsche's texts, and which play with language in supra-literary ways, like, for example, Derrida's text, often keeping the ideas ambiguous and multi-layered. In this context, I am reminded of one of the theoretical essays which Harris wanted me to translate into Malayalam for a volume he was then planning to bring out. Yes, R.B.C. Harris. 10 or 15 selected theoretical essays from English into Malayalam, that was the plan. Some of these essays were originally written in other languages. For example, the one he had identified for me was Helen Sixous's The Laugh of the Medusa. At that point, I was teaching that essay as part of our theory course and was quite happy to try it out in Malayalam. I had started working on it, but then Harris left us. Sixous's The Laugh of the Medusa is actually a lyrical, emotional piece which has a deeply felt feminist concern built into its core. I can imagine how the essay would sound in French. Its emotional impact will be a level higher in French, the language in which Sixou expressed first her thought on the need for female expression. Actually, it was after I was asked to translate it into Malayalam that I tried to find out who translated it into English first. There I found two names, Paula Cohen and Keith Cohen. Not big names, actually. Owing to the rich play of ideas, images, and language itself, Sixous's text is a challenge for any translator and also a deeply satisfying exercise in thought translation. But the point I am trying to make is that The one who translates it should be able to relate to the ideology of the text. No effective translation can be a mechanical exercise. Some philosophy that is part of the source text has to be internalized first for the translation to carry the resonances of the primary text. Added to that, if the translator brings to it a new life, verb, and energy that would suit the target language at the moment of the translation practice, then the translation would be invested with what Walter Benjamin would call an afterlife. In one of the earliest reflections on translation in the 20th century, that is what Walter Benjamin identifies as the task of the translator. While bringing a text into a new language, the translator should, he says, allow the new language to be deeply affected, expanded, and deepened by the source text and its language. Ideally, it should create a hybrid language which touches the senses. While siding with the expressive views of language and not the instrumental views of language, Benjamin suggests that meanings everywhere are in a state of constant flux. And it's up to the translator to capture the multiple semantic worlds gestured by the text in translation and help retain some creative possibilities in the new text as well. Benjamin therefore concluded that such translations and rewritings are not inferior to the source text at all. Actually, he kept the source text and the target text on an equal level. In India, we know how translations often manifested as retellings. The Ramayana Mahabharata retellings in the modern Indian languages are perhaps the best example. In Malayalam, Edikachan Sadhyatma Ramayanam Kilipattu, and in Kannada, Pampa Bharata. Though these are translations, these are also texts in their own right, creative texts in their own right. This is because of the internalization of the source text and the creative potential plus an ideological content that it is endowed with in the translated text, thus creating the semblance of a hybrid text. I suspect that translation practice assumes a word-for-word, sense-for-sense correspondence only with the hegemony of authorship. But Benjamin in the 20th century is advocating a creative intervention of the source text at the level of target language realization, so that meanings would still proliferate. We can evidence the realization of this in many of our bilingual writers and poets, be it O.V. Vijayan, Kamla Das, Girish Karnad, Dilip Chithra, or Sachidananda. These are people who have approached the task of translation with the seriousness that the task demands and deserves, creating creative pieces that are also translations. In the 1986 treatise titled The Year of the Other, autobiography transference translation. Here, the auto in autobiography is spelled with OTO. Derrida answers questions posed to him by critics on the issue of translation. And he seems to join hands with Bentham. To the question, what does the translation do to the source text? Derrida says, I quote, it augments, that is, the translation augments and modifies the original, even as it also modifies the translating language. This process, transforming the original as well as the translation, is the original contract between the original and the translating text, unquote. Though Derrida set this ideal, even at that stage, Derrida was aware of the impossibility of achieving it. He confronted the issue of translation realistically too, and he said, I quote, a text lives on only if it is untranslatable and translatable. To refuse translation is to refuse life, unquote. I repeat that, a text lives on only if it is untranslatable and translatable. To refuse translation is to refuse life. Derrida's essay of 1998 is what I'm actually moving on to, and that essay is titled, What is a Relevant Translation? It is, interestingly enough, this essay is translated by Lawrence Venuti, and it is in this essay that Derrida elaborates on the impossibility and inevitability of translation. In this essay, Derrida understands himself as a failed translator, as one who never managed to pull it off as a translator. He places translators on a grade higher than all others to say that speaking, teaching, writing are activities and are meaningful as jobs only if they carry the proof of translation. Translation is special, he says, because one deals with words from two languages at the same time. In Derrida's own words, one language licks another like a flame or a caress. One language licks another like a flame or a caress. Derrida embarks on the subject of the impossibility of translation by referring to the word relevant in the title, demonstrating how the French relève is actually untranslatable. Anyone who attempts to translate it into any other language, Derrida says, is submitting the experience of translation to the trial of the untranslatable. He comes out with this beautiful aphorism. I quote, I don't believe anything can ever be untranslatable or moreover translatable, unquote. Look at the paradox there. I don't believe anything can ever be untranslatable or moreover translatable. He questions his own impossible formulation. How can one dare say that nothing is translatable and by the same token assert that nothing is untranslatable? But he explains how any given translation, the best or the worst, stands between the two that is, the translatable and the untranslatable, between absolute relevance and the most opaque irrelevance. If that is so, what is a relevant translation? And what could the word relevant itself approximate most to in this context? Does it connote pertinent? In that case, what is a pertinent translation? Does it connote welcome? What is a welcome translation? Or appropriate, or opportune, or well suited? Which one? Derrida opines that it may simply mean good, which also means that you can title the essay, "What is a good translation?" instead of "What is a relevant translation?" And he says, when you say good, you mean a version that performs its mission. He qualifies the adjective good by describing it as a version that performs its mission. In the whole essay, Derrida gives just 2 instances and elaborates on these at length. And that exercise is actually very interesting if one pursues it. He takes 2 words from Joyce's text, Finnegan's Wake. He, that is the third person pronoun he, and the word wars, which is actually a coinage. It doesn't exist as a verb. He was. These 2 words he takes from Finnegan's Wake. And he also takes the phrase, "Mercy seasons justice," from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. And he demonstrates the impossibility of translation. He says how this translation is impossible, but how simultaneously it brings us to the inevitability of it, since it cannot be allowed to die dead in one language. At each stage of the explanation of the particular context in which they occur, he convinces us of the untranslatability of these phrases if you would only know more about the context. But we know that they already stay translated into French within Derrida's own essay. The piece by Derrida may not attain any degree of fullness if one doesn't speak of Venuti's own experience of translating this essay by Derrida. His essay, that is Venuti's essay on this attempt, is titled "Translating Derrida on Translation: Relevance and Disciplinary Resistance." Venuti shares with us his experience of translating Derrida and the great demands it places on the translator. And Lawrence Venuti is a very familiar name for us. Venuti clarifies on how translating Derrida demands a knowledge of the French language, of continental philosophical traditions, of translation practices between French and English, and also the knowledge of discursive strategies which have been used to translate Derrida's writing over 30 years. But besides these knowledges, Venuti says, one should actually desire to translate the reader. While talking about the difficulty of translating the reader's playful and elusive use of language, Venuti speaks of the enormous disciplinary resistance faced by translation in countries like the US. He speaks at length on the strategies devised, that is, the strategies he has devised to deal with Derrida's habit of wordplay in French, and how, at the ideational level, he had to take recourse to philosophical traditions as also cultural theory. According to Venuti, English had to stylistically reset itself to bring in Derrida's character and tone. A near impossible exercise, but almost inevitable, considering the popularity and reputation of Derrida. The academic world at that point was eager to find out what Derrida had to say on translation. It is also ironic that journals like Critical Inquiry, for example, refused to publish Venuti's theoretically informed pieces on translation till Venuti wrote about how he translated Derrida's essay on translation. So I'm actually focusing on Derrida's essay on what is a relevant translation and Venuti's translation of that essay and the experience of translating that essay. Because Venuti also experiences it as impossible but inevitable, his translation of Derrida's essay. A good chunk of my own work pertaining to translation comprises the 8 chapters of Ulysses translated into Malayalam long ago. Several years of reading Joyce, getting to study Irish traditions and continental traditions of history and culture that informed Joyce's works, and Joyce's work, Ulysses in particular, getting acquainted with the histories and experiences behind Ulysses' translations, having to devise strategies of not losing sight of Joyce's comic words and his elusive habits, even as they intertwined with his fascination for the everyday and the commonplace. That constituted the best years of my youth spent on translating chapters of Ulysses. But even before the actual work began, there had to be an overall interpretation which would help highlight Joyce not as a modernist stylist, but as a feminist and as a post-colonial writer. This interpretation was crucial to my project of translation. Everything else evolved from this preliminary figuration. I had begun that translation, that is, when I was doing the chapters of Ulysses, I had begun it conscious of the impossibility of translating Ulysses into Malayalam. Yet, I was convinced of the inevitability of that exercise to honor the work and world of Joyce. Even in the beginning of that work, 2 chapters of Ulysses had nested as anxieties within me. I'll elaborate a little on that. Chapter 11, Sirens, and chapter 14, Oxen of the Sun. And that too for specific reasons. Chapter 11, Sirens, is the most musical chapter of Ulysses, and it is replete with song and music references. The style is based on the form of musical composition called a fugue. In a fugue, voices follow up each other, taking up the same notes, like echoes chasing one another. While honoring the thematic and everyday concerns in the chapter, how does one keep the chapter entirely musical? That exactly was the predicament. Since that stylistic part of the narration is not at all dissociated from the matter or content, if the musical cadences are not preserved in Malayalam, the translation will emerge flat and ineffectual. What are the ways in which one can render the language musical all along so that the chapter stands out as distinctly musical? How is the use of common words to be rendered music? How to create a semblance of music through language? There is nothing thematically musical about this chapter, except perhaps the reference to the Homeric sirens. But there is a strong emotional content that can be carried only by linking it to the emotional content of music. How best to achieve this in the translation? The fugue is a Western form of music. How did the Chinese translator, for example, approach this problem? Can one take cues from that Asian translation? The amount of extra-textual homework that the translator is supposed to do in such cases is humongous. Similarly, the 14th chapter of Ulysses. The location is the National Maternity Hospital on Hall Street, Dublin. The theme is Mrs. Purefoy and her 3 days of labor and subsequent delivery, following her 9 months of pregnancy. Joyce has traced the birth of the modern English language through 9 phases of its historical development in terms of varied styles of English and in terms of different writers who used these styles. It would be impossible to address it through Malayalam. Should the translator talk about the birth of modern Malayalam language and identify 9 phases of change during its developmental history and address it thus? Or to keep the theme of the history of English language going? Should one approach it through Malayalam's development as evidenced through the translations of some of these writers in Malayalam itself during the course of its development? These are major interpretive acts to be carried out by the translator, and it can be carried out only with a coterie of Joyce scholars, translation experts, and poets and writers of Malayalam forming an advisory team in the enterprise. Only then may Malayalam benefit from this translation exercise, even as Joyce becomes a part of the Malayalam repository. The whole chapter is that way untranslatable. But has that stock translations of Ulysses in the many languages in the world? And some of these translations are also considered very effective translations. Joyce himself collaborated in the French translation of Ulysses. So I am actually linking a theoretical postulate with my own experience and anxieties related to the issue of translation, and thus bringing the discussion to a close by leaving these questions open. Translation studies is a vast area, and one can talk about almost anything under the sun in relation to that. But I have limited myself to this single idea of untranslatability, mainly to keep the focus going on small worlds within vast expanses, miniature concepts that lend itself to theoretical inquiry, as also debates around the question of hermeneutics and interpretation. When you come to the question of hermeneutics and interpretation, one may have to invoke the name of Schleiermacher, the philosopher. One is reminded of him, in whose work translation and hermeneutics in the sense of interpretation, are forms of a unitary circularity in which the two phenomena define and clarify one another. So one may have to carry it a little further and bring in the history of hermeneutics as well in the history of translation studies. But just sitting to that, I'll just wind up this exercise. And before I conclude, I will use something which is not directly linked to this talk at all, but on a lighter way. I'll share with you a translation which I did long ago, my first translation of a Kannada poem into English. The poem itself was done by a friend called Mamta Sagar, who is also one of the women poets in Kannada. And I'll just read that piece to bring in a lighter note to this whole exercise. The Kannada title of the poem is Badabaradu Hige Nevu. If literally translated, it would read as, "You should not come here like this." In my translation, English translation, the title is, "Do not walk into me." I'll just read the poem. You should not walk into me like this. You should not walk into me like this, like the emerald eye in the peacock plume. We have never spoken to each other. We haven't spent time sitting beside each other. Still, we can hear each other's heartbeat. We have never spoken to each other. We haven't spent time sitting beside each other. Still, we can hear each other's heartbeat, as if lightning has struck even before the rains came. 1,000 eyes for this desire, a tongue of fire has this desire. 1,000 eyes for this desire, a tongue of fire has this desire. Why does it linger creeping its way in between us. The veins burn, the body shivers from head to toe. The bunch of stars has caught fire. The veins burn, the body shivers from head to toe. The bunch of stars has caught fire. Let's not talk. Let's not talk. Let me dissolve in you like the thick green spread over the valley, like the blue mixed in the ocean. Let me dissolve in you like the thick green spread over the valley, like the blue mixed in the ocean. My child takes me by the finger, gently tugs at it. My child takes me by the finger, gently tugs at it. Sometimes it's like this. Sometimes it's like this. Thank you very much.
The School of Letters family is high